On a chilly night, as Officer Sam Turner patrolled the quiet streets of Birchwood, he expected just another routine shift through the shadowed corners of a troubled neighborhood. But what he didn't expect was to encounter Margaret Bryant, a seemingly harmless elderly woman who would soon ignite a series of events, pushing him to confront the deepest truths he's ever faced. Could she be hiding some secret? And why did she stand there, so calm and unafraid of his authority? Guided by instincts sharpened over years, Sam felt there was something far deeper lurking behind this encounter. What dark revelations lay ahead? And could Officer Turner be the ultimate villain in this tale, or merely one more piece in a far more sinister system? Join us in unraveling the secrets within today's story. What we uncover may just take you on a thrilling and dramatic journey like no other. But before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if this story about the journey for justice and righteousness warms your heart, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay tuned for more powerful stories. Officer Sam Turner gripped the steering wheel of his patrol car, his eyes scanning the dimly lit streets of Birchwood. It was a part of the city that saw little improvement, where the buildings seemed to hunch over the roads in weary resignation, much like the residents who lived there. Each night felt the same. Endless rounds with nothing but his own thoughts for company, except for the occasional flicker of movement in the shadows. Sam's fingers tapped rhythmically on the wheel, the only sound breaking the monotony of his shift. Birchwood wasn't a place Sam enjoyed patrolling. For him, this area felt like a closed book, its pages filled with disappointments, neglect, and unrest. He couldn't remember the last time he'd seen a new shop open here, or the last time anyone bothered to clean up the graffiti that covered nearly every wall. It was a part of town that, in his mind, had already given up on itself. Birchwood, he often thought, was where dreams went to die. As he drove past rows of abandoned buildings and shuttered storefronts, Sam couldn't shake the feeling of resentment growing within him. The streets were lined with broken streetlights, creating pockets of darkness between faint patches of light. He knew each corner, each turn, and each alley by heart. It was all part of the same scenery that had become a nightly fixture. His training had instilled in him a duty to protect, but after years of patrolling Birchwood, he found himself unable to shake the jaded view that this was a place where trouble bred freely. He caught a glance at the clock on his dashboard. 3 hours left. 3 hours before he could clock out, leave this grim part of the city, and escape to his own life, far removed from the problems he saw here. To him, Birchwood's troubles weren't his own. They were products of the people here. People, he believed, who didn't care to improve their situation and who always seemed to blame others for their misfortunes. In the quiet of his patrol car, Sam allowed himself to reflect on how different his expectations of this job had been. When he first put on the uniform, he'd imagined he'd be out making a real difference, keeping his community safe and serving as a force of change. But somewhere along the line, that optimism had faded, replaced by a sense of frustration and a feeling that he was simply going through the motions. Sam's attention shifted when he noticed a figure standing near a closed pharmacy. Squinting, he could make out the shape of a woman, hunched slightly as she clutched a paper bag and leaned on a walking cane. She wore a long, oversized coat that enveloped her small frame, and a wide-brimmed hat cast shadows across her face, obscuring her features. What's she doing out here? Sam wondered, his eyes narrowing. She looked out of place, too old to be wandering the streets this late, and too fragile to be standing alone in a neighborhood like Birchwood. Instinctively, his mind turned toward suspicion. Years of patrolling had honed his ability to detect trouble, or at least, what he assumed trouble looked like. And tonight, this woman looked like trouble. He pulled the patrol car to a slow stop across the street from where she stood. Sam watched her movements closely, waiting for something, anything, that might confirm his gut feeling. She didn't appear to be doing much, simply standing and shifting her weight occasionally, but her mere presence was enough to raise questions in Sam's mind. Here, in Birchwood, being out at this hour was almost reason enough to warrant suspicion. He tightened his grip on the wheel, feeling a familiar rush of adrenaline that he'd grown accustomed to. It wasn't fear, more of an anticipation, a readiness to step in and assert himself, to remind those around him of his authority. To Sam, this woman was about to be reminded of the neighborhood she was standing in and who was in charge of it. Turning off the engine, Sam swung the car door open, the sharp sound of his boots meeting the pavement cutting through the still night air. Officer Sam Turner kept his eyes fixed on the woman standing by the shuttered store, her figure barely illuminated by the dim streetlight above. The streets of Birchwood were nearly empty at this hour, and in the eerie quiet, this lone figure struck Sam as peculiar. She didn't seem to belong here, and his instinct, honed by years of experience, told him to investigate further. The woman leaned on a worn cane with a plastic grocery bag in her other hand, her coat billowing slightly in the breeze, almost swallowing her small frame. Despite her delicate build and unsteady stance, Sam's sense of suspicion intensified. Her presence felt out of place, and his curiosity quickly morphed into a sense of unease. Here she was, an elderly woman, standing alone in a neighborhood known for crime, at a time when most people would be indoors. Sam's initial assumption was that she was likely homeless or struggling in some way. He'd encountered all sorts of people in Birchwood, and he'd learned not to take appearances at face value. There was always something more going on beneath the surface, and sometimes the most unassuming people could be involved in the messiest situations. He squinted as he studied her further. She was hunched over slightly, her weight visibly shifting from one leg to the other as though she were trying to ease some discomfort. Yet, for someone standing in the middle of a rundown neighborhood late at night, she seemed unusually calm, too calm. His instincts urged him forward, each step toward her feeling more like a necessity than a choice. "Why are you here?" Sam murmured to himself as he crossed the street. He wasn't sure why he was feeling so on edge, but the closer he got, the more convinced he was that something about her didn't add up. In his experience, elderly people out this late were often in some kind of trouble. Whether they were victims or unwitting participants, they usually looked nervous, even a bit lost. But this woman was different. She didn't look lost or vulnerable. She looked like she had a purpose, standing there with a quiet dignity he hadn't expected. When he finally approached her, he cleared his throat. "Excuse me, ma'am," he called out, his tone firm but not harsh. She turned slowly to face him, her face still partially concealed beneath the wide brim of her hat. He couldn't make out her full expression, but he noticed a slight smile on her lips, as though his presence didn't surprise or intimidate her in the slightest. "Evening, officer," she replied, her voice soft yet clear. Sam's gaze dropped to the grocery bag she held. It didn't seem heavy, just a simple plastic bag holding a few small items. He scanned the area around her, looking for anything out of the ordinary. A stray bag, a hidden accomplice, anything that would explain why she was here. But there was nothing. "Can I ask what you're doing out here?" he inquired, a slight edge creeping into his voice. His unease hadn't lessened. In fact, her calmness only intensified it. "Just passing through," she replied simply, as if her answer should be enough to satisfy him. Her calm response felt like a subtle dismissal, and Sam felt his irritation growing. People rarely answered him with such nonchalance, especially not in Birchwood. "Passing through?" he repeated, his tone growing more skeptical. "At this hour? Don't you think it's a bit late to be wandering around?" She tilted her head slightly, as though considering his question. "It's not the safest neighborhood, you're right, but I know these streets better than most," she said, a quiet confidence evident in her voice. There was no nervousness, no attempt to avoid his gaze. She met his eyes directly, her expression unchanging. Sam felt a strange, prickling sensation, as though he were the one under scrutiny, not her. Her calmness felt like a challenge, like she was daring him to make assumptions. He wasn't sure what to make of her. She looked frail, but something about her demeanor suggested a deeper strength. Still, he couldn't shake his growing suspicion. "Do you live around here?" Sam asked, his tone now demanding more than questioning. The woman nodded, lifting the grocery bag slightly. "I'm just on my way home. Picked up a few things before the store closed," she said, the hint of a smile returning to her face. It was as though she knew something he didn't, and it irritated him. "Mind if I see what's in the bag?" he asked, his voice firmer now. He half expected her to refuse, to say something that would justify his suspicions. Instead, she shrugged and held the bag out to him, her expression unchanged. Sam peered inside, finding nothing unusual. A loaf of bread, a small carton of milk, a few canned goods. Nothing that suggested she was hiding anything. He frowned, his fingers itching to find something, anything, that would explain the nagging feeling that something was off. "Is this everything?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. He knew he was being hard on her, but he couldn't stop himself. She nodded again, her gaze steady. "That's everything, officer," she replied evenly. "Now, if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." Sam felt a flicker of frustration. Her calmness, her refusal to be intimidated. It felt like a quiet defiance, and it threw him off balance. He was used to people reacting with a mix of fear and respect, but she gave him neither. It was as if she saw right through him, like his authority didn't matter. "Be careful," he said, his voice holding a warning note. "This isn't a place you want to be wandering alone, especially at night." She inclined her head slightly, an almost respectful gesture, but her calm gaze remained. "I appreciate the concern, officer, but I can take care of myself." Sam felt a surge of irritation, but he didn't press further. He'd expected her to show some sign of fear or vulnerability, but instead, she'd met his gaze and calmly asserted her independence. Officer Sam Turner stood motionless, watching as the woman, Margaret, she'd said her name was, made no move to hurry off. Instead, she remained composed, her gaze steady, a quiet confidence emanating from her that only served to deepen his frustration. This wasn't how encounters typically went for him, and the unsettling sense of losing control began to creep into his thoughts. "Let's go over this one more time," Sam said, his voice a notch colder as he stepped closer to her. "Why are you out here at this hour? You say you're headed home, but it's almost midnight. You have any idea what kind of things happen in this neighborhood?" Margaret didn't flinch. She looked back at him with the same untroubled expression she'd worn from the start, as if his questions were mere formalities. Her eyes were calm but not dismissive, and she tilted her head slightly as she replied, "I understand, officer, but I assure you, I'm just on my way home. I don't mean any harm." He noticed the way she spoke, her voice steady yet tinged with something that unnerved him, a sense of certainty he wasn't accustomed to encountering. It made him want to push harder, to press until her composure cracked, revealing something more vulnerable. "Look," Sam said, his patience thinning, "I don't know what game you think you're playing, but wandering around here with groceries at midnight, it doesn't make sense." He gestured toward her grocery bag. "You say you just bought some food? At this time of night?" Margaret nodded, lifting the bag slightly to emphasize her point. "I picked up a few things before the corner store closed. I needed some milk and bread, that's all." Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if they were two neighbors having a casual conversation instead of a police officer grilling a lone woman on an empty street. Sam felt a prickling irritation, the kind that always hit when someone didn't respond as expected. Most people in her position would have given a hurried explanation or shown some level of discomfort. But this woman seemed unaffected by his uniform, his questioning, or the quiet but undeniable power he projected. She wasn't tense. In fact, she seemed perfectly comfortable standing there, as though she were in her own home rather than on a dark street with a cop challenging her story. "Show me what's in the bag," he demanded, his voice sharp with a mix of suspicion and frustration. Margaret's face remained calm, almost serene. She lifted the grocery bag toward him, offering a glimpse of the contents. Inside, he could see the loaf of bread, the small carton of milk, and a few canned goods, ordinary, mundane items. There was nothing unusual or incriminating, nothing to justify his suspicions. But instead of putting his mind at ease, her calm compliance only added fuel to the fire. Her quietness, her self-possession, they unsettled him, as if she were refusing to acknowledge the authority he wielded. He knew he should let her go, that there was nothing here to pursue, yet he found himself wanting to press further. "That's it?" he asked, his voice thick with disbelief. "Just bread and milk?" Margaret gave a single nod, her expression unchanged. "Just the basics, officer. It's late, and I'm tired. If you're done here, I'd like to get home." Her words felt like a quiet challenge, and Sam could feel his pulse quicken. She had to be hiding something, he reasoned. Her lack of fear, her refusal to act like everyone else he encountered. It wasn't normal. In his mind, people in neighborhoods like Birchwood knew better than to stand up to the police. Yet here she was, a small, elderly woman who looked almost fragile, holding his gaze without a hint of intimidation. "Look," Sam said, lowering his voice to a near growl, "it's late. Most people wouldn't be out here alone, especially not someone like you. What's really going on?" Margaret met his gaze, her face thoughtful yet calm, as though she were studying him just as intently as he was studying her. "Officer," she said softly, "I don't mean any trouble. I'm simply trying to get home. There's no reason for you to be concerned." Her calmness only served to ignite his frustration further. It felt like defiance, like a subtle refusal to bend to his authority. And Sam wasn't used to feeling powerless, especially in a situation where he held the obvious advantage. The fact that she seemed unimpressed by his questioning made him feel even more determined to assert himself. "I need to see your ID," he said, stepping closer, hoping to find something that would prove his suspicions were justified. For the first time, Margaret sighed, her expression softening into one of mild exasperation. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a well-worn wallet, from which she extracted her ID. Sam took it from her, his eyes flicking over the name and address. Margaret Bryant, a local resident, as she'd claimed. There was nothing suspicious about her ID, but he felt his control slipping away. His grip on the ID tightened as he handed it back to her, his face hardening. "Why are you really here, Miss Bryant?" he asked, his voice dropping lower. "I'm not buying this story of groceries and late-night walks. Something doesn't add up." Margaret slipped her ID back into her wallet with a calm, measured motion. Then she looked up at him, her eyes unflinching. "Officer," she replied quietly, "I've told you the truth. I've lived in this neighborhood a long time, and I know it well. I don't need to defend myself for walking home." The calm conviction in her voice made his skin prickle. She wasn't just answering his questions. She was challenging the unspoken rules that had kept people in Birchwood obedient and cautious. Her confidence irritated him, sparking a deep-seated anger he couldn't quite control. "You should be careful," he muttered, leaning closer, his voice laced with barely restrained frustration. "This isn't a place for people like you to be wandering alone." Margaret's expression softened slightly, her eyes reflecting a quiet empathy that caught him off guard. "Officer," she said gently, "perhaps you should ask yourself why you're so concerned." And with that, she turned, taking a step away, leaving Sam standing there, his hands clenched at his sides, his frustration simmering. He had come looking for trouble, and in that moment, he realized it wasn't her that had made him uneasy. It was something within himself. Sam Turner clenched his jaw as he watched Margaret turn to leave, the soft clack of her cane tapping against the concrete. Each step she took felt like an affront to his authority, a quiet declaration that she didn't fear him, that his questions and uniform held no power over her. Her calm demeanor, her steady gaze, it all unsettled him in a way he couldn't shake. "Hold on a minute," Sam called out, his tone sharper than he intended. Margaret paused, turning slightly to look at him, her expression unreadable, and waited without a word. The silence felt heavier, thicker, and Sam realized that she was waiting for him to speak, as though she had all the time in the world. He strode up to her, each step echoing on the empty street. He couldn't understand it, why this simple encounter with an elderly woman was getting under his skin so profoundly. He was used to being in control, used to people responding to his authority with a mixture of respect and wariness. But this woman, she was neither impressed nor afraid. "Look," he began, his voice low, "I don't know what you think this is, but this isn't just a walk home. There's more to it than that, isn't there?" His gaze bore into hers, searching for any flicker of doubt or fear. Margaret's eyes softened slightly, and she tilted her head in quiet consideration before speaking. "Officer Turner," she said calmly, "I've told you everything. I don't know why you're so determined to find something wrong, but I assure you, I'm simply on my way home. Nothing more." The patience in her voice grated on him, fueling his growing frustration. He felt the need to assert himself, to reclaim the control he sensed slipping away with each calm word she uttered. "Why are you being so difficult?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "I'm just doing my job, trying to keep this neighborhood safe, and your attitude isn't helping." Margaret looked at him steadily, her expression unchanging. "And I'm simply doing what I need to do, officer," she replied softly. "I'm not sure why that's such a problem for you." Her words stung. The way she maintained her composure, meeting his anger with calmness, felt like a challenge, a refusal to acknowledge his authority in a way he'd never experienced before. He wanted her to feel his presence, to understand that in this situation, he was the one in control. The irritation in his chest grew, twisting into a hard knot of frustration that he couldn't ignore. "Hand me your ID," he ordered, his voice rough with the edge of his impatience. Without a word, Margaret reached into her coat pocket, pulling out her wallet with a slow, deliberate motion. Her eyes never left his as she held the ID out to him, her hand steady and calm. There was no hint of defensiveness, no sign of the compliance he was used to seeing. It felt more like she was indulging him, as though this whole interaction was a formality that she had already moved beyond in her mind. He took the ID from her, his fingers grazing the worn edges of the card. His eyes fell on the name, Margaret Bryant. It was an unremarkable name, one that matched her appearance and the calm, quiet dignity she carried. There was nothing suspicious in her address or identification, and yet he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. He handed the ID back, his hand moving quickly, almost as though he didn't want to admit how much this simple piece of plastic had intensified his frustration. "You know," he said, his voice a low growl, "most people in this neighborhood wouldn't be so calm right now. They'd understand the kind of trouble they could be in. But you're standing here like none of this bothers you at all." Margaret tucked the ID back into her wallet, her face showing no sign of fear or even irritation. Instead, she regarded him with a look of quiet empathy that only made him more uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, officer, if I've caused you any frustration," she replied, her voice as calm and measured as before. "But I assure you, I'm no threat to anyone." Sam could feel his patience thinning, his composure unraveling as he struggled to regain control of the situation. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he muttered, his gaze darkening. "You think that by acting calm, you're somehow above this? That I can't see through you?" Margaret's expression softened, her eyes reflecting something he couldn't quite name, something that unsettled him even more than her calmness had. "Officer Turner," she replied softly, "I'm simply a woman trying to make her way home. Whatever you're seeing here, it's something I can't control." Her words struck him like a blow, and he felt his fists clench at his sides, a tension he couldn't shake. There was something about her presence, her unshakable calm, that made him feel exposed, like she was seeing past his uniform, his authority, to something deeper within him, something he hadn't been prepared to confront. He wanted to tell her to leave, to put this interaction behind him, but he couldn't bring himself to end it just yet. There was something about her that felt unfinished, a quiet defiance that lingered in the air between them. "You should be careful," he said, his voice tight with an edge of warning. "Not everyone here would be so patient with you. Not everyone would ask as many questions as I have. You're lucky I'm the one who found you." Margaret inclined her head slightly, her gaze steady. "I appreciate your concern, officer," she said softly, "but I'm exactly where I need to be. And perhaps so are you." Her words hung in the air, leaving him momentarily speechless. She turned to go, her steps calm and unhurried, leaving him standing in the middle of the empty street, his fists clenched, his mind swirling with a mixture of anger, confusion, and a nagging sense of vulnerability that he couldn't quite name. For the first time, Sam Turner felt as though he wasn't in control, as though this quiet, unassuming woman had managed to slip past the armor he wore, leaving him with questions he couldn't answer. And as she disappeared into the shadows, he was left wondering if he would ever shake the strange unease she'd stirred within him. As Margaret's figure began to disappear into the dimly lit street, Officer Sam Turner felt his frustration reach a boiling point. He couldn't allow this encounter to end with her walking away so calmly, as though she'd somehow won a silent battle. She hadn't yielded to his authority, hadn't given him the satisfaction of fear or even respect. Instead, she'd left him feeling exposed, vulnerable, a sensation he couldn't bear. Without fully realizing his actions, he took a few long strides and reached out, grabbing her arm. The suddenness of the movement made her stop, but Margaret remained composed, her gaze shifting slowly from his hand on her arm to his face. "Let go," she said calmly, her voice devoid of fear or anger. It was the same steady tone that had ignited his frustration from the start, and now, with her arm in his grip, he could feel his control slipping further. "You think you can just walk away?" Sam asked, his voice tight with restrained fury. "That I'd let you go without answering my questions?" Margaret tilted her head, regarding him with the same calm, collected expression that only deepened his resentment. "I've answered your questions, officer," she replied softly. "If you're still unsatisfied, that's something for you to work out, not me." Her words stung, cutting through his attempts to reassert control. He tightened his grip on her arm, almost as if trying to hold on to whatever power he felt slipping away. She looked down briefly at his hand, her expression unchanged, yet somehow that simple gesture felt like a quiet condemnation. "Why don't you just listen?" he growled, his frustration morphing into anger. "Why don't you show a little respect?" Margaret met his gaze, her expression calm yet firm. "Respect goes both ways, Officer Turner," she said quietly. "If you truly wish for it, perhaps you should consider offering it." Her words sliced through him, and he felt his grip on her arm tighten involuntarily. The confidence in her voice, her refusal to cower. He couldn't stand it. This wasn't how these encounters were supposed to go. People didn't speak back to him, especially not in this neighborhood, especially not people who were, in his mind, part of the problem. "You think you're untouchable, don't you?" he muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "Like you're above everything that's happening around here." Margaret held his gaze, her face still calm, almost pitying. "Officer," she replied softly, "it seems you're letting your anger control you. That won't end well for either of us." The warning in her voice, the quiet calm with which she said it, only fueled his anger further. He felt his control slipping completely, the frustration boiling over as he clenched his fist. "Is that so?" he sneered, his voice barely a whisper now. "You think you're the one in control here?" Before he could fully process what he was doing, his hand shot out, connecting with her cheek in a sharp, quick motion. The impact echoed faintly in the quiet street, punctuating the stillness with a jarring finality. Margaret stumbled slightly, her cane wavering in her grasp as she caught her balance. For a brief moment, her face registered the pain, a flicker of discomfort crossing her calm expression. But she didn't raise a hand to her face, didn't show any signs of fear or even anger. Instead, she looked at him, her gaze steady, a calm resolve in her eyes. "Is that what you wanted?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Yet her words carried an undeniable weight. "To assert your power in this way?" Sam felt a chill run down his spine, a cold, creeping sensation that twisted in his gut. The satisfaction he'd expected to feel, the sense of reclaiming control, was absent. Instead, he was left with a hollow emptiness, an unsettling realization that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Margaret straightened, her expression composed as she studied him. "You may wear that badge, officer," she said softly, "but it doesn't give you the right to behave this way. Not toward anyone." The calmness with which she spoke, the unwavering conviction in her voice, was like a blow to his already shattered sense of control. She wasn't pleading, wasn't apologizing. She was standing her ground, challenging him without raising her voice or showing a hint of weakness. "You should be careful," he muttered, his voice trembling with a mixture of anger and something else, something he didn't want to admit, regret. "You don't know who you're dealing with." Margaret's gaze softened, and for the first time, he saw a glimmer of sadness in her eyes, as though she pitied him more than feared him. "Perhaps, Officer Turner, it is you who doesn't know who you're dealing with," she replied quietly. Her words hung in the air, lingering in the silence that followed. Sam felt his heart race, his mind spinning as he tried to comprehend the meaning behind her calm defiance. He'd expected her to be rattled, maybe even beg for leniency, but instead, she stood there, looking at him as though she could see straight through the uniform, through the badge, into something he'd long tried to bury. He released her arm, his hand dropping to his side, suddenly feeling heavy, weighed down by the implications of his actions. She turned her gaze away, looking down at the grocery bag that had fallen to the ground during the encounter. Slowly, she bent to pick it up, her movements unhurried, her composure unbroken. As she straightened, she looked back at him, her face calm, her gaze piercing. "Be careful, officer," she said softly. "There are consequences to every choice we make, every action we take, and some consequences can never be undone." With that, she turned and continued down the street, her cane tapping against the pavement, her form growing smaller as she disappeared into the shadows. Sam stood there, rooted to the spot, the weight of her words pressing down on him, filling the quiet street with an eerie sense of finality. For the first time in his career, he felt a sense of dread, an awareness that he'd crossed a boundary he could never return from. Margaret's calm warning echoed in his mind, a quiet reminder that no amount of authority could shield him from the consequences of his own actions. As the silence enveloped him, Sam Turner realized that he hadn't just lost control of the encounter, he'd lost control of himself, and in that moment, he felt the depth of his own vulnerability, a vulnerability that no badge could ever protect him from. Officer Sam Turner stood frozen, watching Margaret as she continued down the dark street. His mind was a blur, tangled in the weight of his own actions and the growing realization that something felt irrevocably wrong. He couldn't shake the gnawing sensation in his chest, a mix of regret and dread that had been eating away at him since the moment he'd raised his hand against her. But before he could fully process his thoughts, he saw her stop. Margaret turned slowly, her figure framed by the dim glow of the streetlight, and walked back toward him with the same calm, collected stride she'd maintained throughout the encounter. This time, however, there was something in her expression he hadn't seen before, a silent but powerful authority that seemed to radiate from her in waves. "Officer Turner," she began, her voice steady but carrying a weight he hadn't noticed before, "I think it's time you understood exactly who you've been dealing with." Her words sent a chill down his spine. The way she spoke, the calm precision in her tone, left no room for doubt. There was a purpose behind her words, a purpose that he felt completely unprepared to face. He swallowed hard, struggling to maintain his composure. What are you talking about?" he stammered, the confidence in his voice wavering. "You're just some woman walking alone at night. Don't try to make this into something it's not." But Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she reached slowly into her coat pocket, pulling out a small leather wallet. She held it up, letting the dim light illuminate the badge within. The gleam of gold caught Sam's eye, and his heart skipped a beat as he took in the unmistakable emblem, the FBI badge. Sam's breath hitched, his mind racing to process the realization of what he was seeing. This woman, this calm, unassuming woman he had suspected, confronted, and eventually struck, was a federal agent. The implications crashed over him like a wave, each one hitting harder than the last. "I am Special Agent Margaret Bryant," she said, her tone carrying a quiet authority that silenced any retort he might have had. "I've been working undercover in this area for months, gathering evidence on cases that go far beyond what you can imagine." Her words rang in his ears, each one driving home the enormity of his actions. He had assaulted a federal agent, someone who was not only innocent but working on a case that he had just endangered with his reckless behavior. Panic began to claw at his insides as he realized the depth of his overreach. I didn't know," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know you were an agent," she finished for him, her gaze piercing as she held his gaze. "No, you didn't. And that, Officer Turner, is precisely the problem." Sam's pulse quickened, a cold sweat breaking out along his brow. He wanted to explain himself, to justify his actions, but each excuse that came to mind felt weak, insubstantial. He had no explanation that could undo what he'd done, no words that could absolve him from the mistake he'd made. Margaret studied him for a long moment, her expression both calm and unwavering. "You let your assumptions dictate your actions," she continued. "You decided who I was, what I represented, without a shred of evidence or understanding. And now, because of those assumptions, you've compromised your career, and possibly much more." Her words cut through him, each one sinking deep, leaving a hollow ache in their wake. He felt like the ground was shifting beneath him, like everything he had built up in his career, his reputation, was crumbling. He'd always seen himself as someone who upheld the law, someone who represented order and control. But now, facing the reality of his actions, he felt exposed, vulnerable, a man stripped of the very authority he'd relied upon. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible as he forced himself to meet her gaze. Margaret's face softened slightly, though her eyes held an unmistakable resolve. "That depends on you," she replied. "There are consequences for actions like yours, Officer Turner, and I intend to see them through. But how severe those consequences will be depends on whether you're willing to accept responsibility." Sam's throat tightened, the weight of her words pressing down on him. Accepting responsibility felt like an impossible task, like admitting to himself that everything he'd done had led him to this moment. But deep down, he knew there was no way out of this, not without losing every shred of integrity he had left. He took a deep, shaky breath, his hands trembling as he attempted to gather his thoughts. What do you want me to do?" he asked, the question sounding hollow in his own ears. Margaret's gaze didn't waver, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "First, you'll file a full report on what happened here tonight," she replied. "No excuses, no justifications, just the truth." Sam nodded, feeling the weight of her command settle over him. Writing that report meant confronting every choice he'd made, every misstep that had brought him to this point. But as daunting as it felt, he knew he had no other option. "And beyond that," Margaret continued, her voice softer now, "I suggest you take a long, hard look at yourself, Officer Turner. This isn't just about me. It's about what you represent, what kind of officer you want to be. If you can't control your own anger, if you can't respect the people you're supposed to protect, then maybe it's time to rethink your role." Her words hit him harder than any reprimand he'd received, leaving him feeling both chastened and exposed. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth was undeniable. He had let his assumptions dictate his actions, and now he was paying the price. Margaret looked at him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, before finally turning to leave. Sam watched her go, the sound of her cane tapping against the pavement fading into the distance. He felt as though he were standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss he'd created with his own actions. As the street grew silent, he was left alone with the gravity of his choices, a realization settling over him with a crushing finality. The consequences he faced were more than just professional, they were deeply personal. And as the weight of that truth bore down on him, he understood, perhaps for the first time, that authority without accountability meant nothing. Sam Turner's heart pounded as he stood alone on the street, the faint tap of Margaret's cane fading into the distance. His mind was a storm of panic, regret, and fear, churning together as the reality of what he had done sank deeper into his conscience. He had lost control, let his anger consume him, and now he was staring down the consequences with nowhere to hide. Moments later, the piercing wail of sirens shattered the silence, growing louder as a squad car pulled up to the curb. Backup had arrived, and with it, the first sign of Sam's impending downfall. The lights flashed against the dim buildings around him, casting stark, accusatory shadows on the pavement. Two officers stepped out, their faces tense and unreadable as they approached him. Sam recognized them. Fellow colleagues, men he had once shared shifts and stories with, men who had once looked to him as a figure of authority. Now, their eyes held no respect, only the weight of duty, and he felt the sharp sting of humiliation settle over him like a heavy shroud. "Officer Turner," one of them said, his voice careful and neutral, "we're here to place you under arrest." Sam's breath caught, his pulse racing. He opened his mouth to protest, to explain himself, but the words refused to come. He could see in their eyes that any defense he offered would fall on deaf ears. Margaret's revelation as an undercover agent, his physical assault on her, it was all too damning. You can't be serious," he managed, his voice hoarse. But as the other officer stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs, the reality hit him with full force. They were serious. He was no longer Officer Turner, no longer a respected figure in the precinct. He was now just another man under suspicion, about to be processed as a criminal. "Turn around," the officer ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sam swallowed hard, his body moving as if on autopilot, his hands raised slowly before coming to rest behind his back. He felt the cold bite of metal as the handcuffs snapped shut, their unforgiving grip sealing his fate. As they led him to the squad car, he felt the weight of shame pressing down on him. He had walked this path countless times, escorting suspects in much the same way. But now, each step felt like a betrayal of everything he had once stood for, every vow he had taken to uphold the law. The very system he had used to command authority had now turned on him, and he was powerless to stop it. They guided him into the back seat, and as the door slammed shut, he felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. The precinct he had once entered with pride, the building that had symbolized his power and purpose, now awaited him as a place of judgment. As the squad car pulled away, Sam's thoughts were a chaotic blur of anger, denial, and self-recrimination. The drive to the precinct was brief but suffocating. The silence in the car felt heavy, broken only by the distant hum of the city outside, a stark reminder of how quickly one's world could change. He clenched his fists, the handcuffs digging into his wrists, as the weight of his actions pressed down on him with an unbearable intensity. When they arrived, he was escorted into the precinct by the same officers he had once considered allies. Heads turned as he walked past, faces he recognized staring with a mixture of disbelief, disappointment, and, for some, quiet satisfaction. The whispers began almost immediately, the murmurs of disbelief spreading through the room like wildfire. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, questioning how a man they had once respected could fall so far. At the booking desk, he was processed like any other suspect. His badge, his service weapon, all symbols of his former authority, were stripped away, leaving him vulnerable and exposed. As they took his fingerprints and mugshot, he felt a rush of humiliation that was almost unbearable. The sterile camera flash burned the moment into his memory, a stark reminder of the irrevocable shift in his life. He was then led to a holding cell, its cold, bare walls a far cry from the authority he had once wielded. The clank of the metal door slamming shut behind him echoed in the small room, the final punctuation to a nightmarish turn of events. He was alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights and the distant sounds of the precinct he had once commanded with confidence. Sitting on the hard bench, Sam buried his face in his hands, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like an iron shroud. He had never imagined he would end up here, on the other side of the bars, his career, his reputation, all unraveling in the span of a single night. He replayed his encounter with Margaret over and over in his mind, each detail cutting deeper, each misstep more glaring. The news of his arrest spread quickly, reaching the ears of colleagues, friends, and even family. He could almost feel the shockwaves ripple through the lives he had touched, the whispers that would follow him wherever he went. The man who had once held the badge, the authority, was now the subject of gossip, a tarnished figure caught in the harsh light of his own actions. As the hours passed, Sam's initial panic and anger gave way to a deeper, more painful realization. Margaret's words echoed in his mind, a relentless reminder of the truth he could no longer ignore. He had let his anger consume him, allowed his assumptions to dictate his actions, and now he was facing the consequences. The authority he had clung to for so long had become a hollow shell, a facade that had crumbled under the weight of his own flaws. The night dragged on, the quiet of the cell amplifying his regrets, each memory a reminder of his downfall. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and he knew that from this moment forward, Nothing would ever be the same. As he sat there, stripped of everything he once held dear, Sam Turner understood that this was just the beginning. The arrest, the whispers, the judgment. It was only the first step in a long and painful reckoning. And as the reality of his situation settled over him, he realized that the journey ahead would be one of accountability, redemption, and facing the man he had become. In the early hours after Officer Sam Turner's arrest, Special Agent Margaret Bryant returned to the FBI field office, her mind already racing with the next steps. The night's events had been a tipping point, the beginning of a much larger unraveling. Sam Turner's actions had been shocking, but they were just one part of a deeply embedded problem in his precinct, a web of corruption that Margaret and her team had long suspected but had yet to fully expose. As she entered the bustling office, Margaret's colleagues were already gathering around a table scattered with documents, surveillance photos, and notes from months of investigative work. Margaret took her place among them, her gaze sharp and focused. This was the moment they had been working toward, the moment they would finally start connecting the pieces. Turner's arrest is going to send shockwaves through the precinct, said her supervisor, Agent Neil Harris, standing at the head of the table. We need to move fast before anyone tries to cover their tracks. Turner might be the first domino, but there are others involved, and we're going to need every piece of evidence we can gather. Margaret nodded in agreement. Her experience in the field had taught her that corruption rarely existed in isolation. Sam's actions were part of a larger culture of abuse, one that had been allowed to fester unchecked for far too long. She knew that her investigation wouldn't end with Sam. It would lead them to figures much higher in the chain, people who had enabled and encouraged these behaviors. Turner's record already shows multiple complaints, Margaret said, flipping through a file filled with internal reports and citizen grievances. But every complaint against him was dismissed or swept under the rug. The people covering for him go all the way up to his superiors, and I'd wager Lieutenant Hanine is involved. Harris nodded grimly. We've had our suspicions about Hanine for a while now. He's been in that precinct for years, always managing to evade scrutiny. If Turner talks, we might finally have a chance to bring Hanine down and expose the network of officers he's protected. Margaret scanned the room, feeling the weight of the task before them. Lieutenant Greg Hanine was a respected figure in the department, known for his authoritative presence and strict demeanor. Yet beneath the surface, rumors had circulated for years about his involvement in everything from covering up misconduct to accepting bribes in exchange for favorable treatment. If they were going to take down Hanine, they needed a strong, unassailable case. We need Turner to cooperate, Margaret said, her tone decisive. He's the key to linking Hanine to these abuses. If we can get him to talk, we'll have the evidence we need to bring the whole operation down. Harris looked thoughtful, crossing his arms as he considered her words. Turner is stubborn, but he's facing serious charges. Assaulting a federal agent isn't something he can walk away from easily. We'll offer him a deal, cooperate, and we'll push for leniency. But if he refuses, he's going to face the full weight of the charges. Later that morning, Margaret made her way to the holding area where Sam was being detained. The corridors of the FBI facility felt cold and sterile, a stark contrast to the chaos that had surrounded his arrest. She found him in a small interrogation room, his head lowered, his hands resting on the table in front of him. The fire and defiance that had fueled his actions earlier had faded, replaced by a haunted, hollow look. As she took a seat across from him, Sam didn't meet her gaze. He seemed lost, adrift in the consequences of his own choices, the reality of his situation pressing down on him like a weight he couldn't bear. Officer Turner, she began, her voice steady, professional, but not without a trace of empathy. You're facing some serious charges. Assaulting a federal agent alone is enough to end your career, but we both know that's just the start. Sam's jaw tightened, his gaze finally lifting to meet hers. She could see the fear, the regret, and something else, a flicker of defiance, though it was quickly fading under the crushing weight of his circumstances. You want me to talk, he muttered, his voice hoarse. You want me to betray my colleagues, my precinct. Margaret's gaze was unyielding. This isn't about betrayal, Sam. This is about accountability. The people you've protected, the orders you've followed blindly, They've led you to this point. You need to decide if you want to take responsibility and help us uncover the truth, or if you're willing to go down with them." He looked away, his hands clenched on the table. "Lieutenant Hanin has been like a mentor to me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He taught me everything I know about this job." Turning on him, "It's not something I can do lightly." Margaret softened her tone, leaning forward slightly. "I understand loyalty, Sam, but loyalty to a corrupt system is a betrayal of the very people you swore to protect. Hanin has allowed abuses to flourish in that precinct. This is your chance to do the right thing." For a long moment, there was only silence. Sam's gaze remained fixed on the table, his face contorted in a mixture of shame and contemplation. Margaret could see the struggle within him, the battle between his loyalty to a man who had once been his role model and the realization of how deeply he had been complicit. Finally, he let out a shaky breath, nodding slowly. "If I cooperate, what happens to me?" Margaret leaned back, her gaze unwavering. "You'll still have to answer for your actions, but we'll advocate for leniency. Help us bring down Hanin, and we can push for a reduced sentence." Sam swallowed hard, his face a mask of resignation. He looked as though he had aged overnight, the weight of his decisions etched into every line on his face. "I'll talk," he said quietly. "I'll tell you everything I know." Margaret nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and resolve. Sam Turner was just the beginning, the first piece of a puzzle that stretched far beyond one officer's misdeeds. But with his cooperation, they would have the evidence needed to dismantle a system of corruption that had gone unchecked for far too long. As she left the room, Margaret's mind was already racing with the possibilities, the next steps in the case. The web of corruption within Sam's precinct would be unraveled, piece by piece, until every last player was exposed. And with each revelation, she knew they were one step closer to justice. Lieutenant Greg Hanin paced his dimly lit office, his mind racing as he processed the implications of Sam Turner's arrest. The news had spread quickly, and with it, a creeping sense of dread had begun to settle over him. He had always operated with the assumption that his actions would remain hidden, shielded by the loyalty he commanded within the precinct. But now, with Turner in custody and the FBI's attention bearing down on his operation, he knew his time was running short. Hanin pulled out his phone, scrolling through his list of contacts. He had built a network of trusted officers, people he had protected and manipulated to maintain his control. But he also had ties with figures outside the precinct, individuals who specialized in taking care of loose ends. And right now, Sam Turner had become the loosest end of all. With a grim expression, he dialed a number and waited. When the call was answered, he spoke in a low, controlled tone. "I have a situation," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Turner's in FBI custody, and I don't think he'll hold up under the pressure. I need to make sure he understands the consequences of talking." The voice on the other end grunted in agreement. "Consider it done. We'll make sure he knows it's in his best interest to stay quiet." As he ended the call, Hanin allowed himself a moment of satisfaction, though it was tinged with unease. He had done this before, sent reminders, subtle or otherwise, to those who threatened his operation. But this time felt different. The FBI's involvement was a new factor, one he couldn't entirely control. Margaret Bryant was thorough, relentless, and she had the backing of a federal institution he couldn't intimidate or bribe. Hanin knew that the usual methods might not be enough to keep his network intact. Meanwhile, at the FBI office, Margaret Bryant and her team were well aware of Hanin's reputation and his willingness to silence threats by any means necessary. She had anticipated his reaction to Turner's cooperation and had taken extra precautions to ensure his safety. Turner had been moved to a secure facility, and additional guards were assigned to prevent any interference from Hanin's associates. "Agent Bryant," Harris said as he approached her desk, a file in hand. "We've picked up some chatter that Hanin might be mobilizing his contacts to pressure Turner. It's likely he'll try to send a message, something to scare him into silence." Margaret nodded, not surprised. Hanin's desperate. He knows Turner is the key to exposing his entire operation. If he can't silence him, he knows his days are numbered. Harris placed the file in front of her, flipping it open to reveal surveillance photos of individuals connected to Hanin's network. "We've identified a few of Hanin's main enforcers," he said, pointing to the images. "These are the guys he uses when he needs to make a point. We're putting them under surveillance, but we need to move fast if we're going to stop him from making any last moves." Margaret scanned the photos, her mind already racing with possibilities. They needed a plan, something that would not only protect Turner but also dismantle Hanin's network from the inside out. Hanin's associates wouldn't be easy to turn, but with the right pressure, she knew they could force a few of them to break ranks and cooperate. "We'll put together a list of his known contacts," Margaret said, her voice steady. "Anyone connected to him is a potential target for our investigation. If we can isolate one of his enforcers, get them to talk, we can start taking apart his operation from the ground up." Over the next several days, Margaret and her team worked tirelessly, setting up surveillance on Hanin's contacts, monitoring their movements, and intercepting communications. They were careful, strategic, waiting for the right moment to apply pressure on the key figures in Hanin's network. Each intercepted message, each observed interaction was another piece of evidence, another step closer to dismantling the system Hanin had built. In the meantime, Hanin was beginning to feel the walls closing in. His usual channels of influence were failing him. Officers who had once looked to him for guidance now kept their distance, aware that their loyalty to him could become a liability. It was as though his own network was fraying at the edges, unraveling as the FBI closed in. One night, as he sat alone in his office, the weight of his choices pressing down on him, Hanin received an unexpected call. It was one of his former associates, a man who had once been a reliable ally but now seemed nervous, almost panicked. "Greg," the man said, his voice shaking. "They're on to us. The FBI, they've been watching. I can't do this anymore. I have a family. I have kids." Hanin's grip tightened on the phone, anger flaring in his chest. "You listen to me," he said, his voice low and threatening. "If you even think about talking, you'll regret it. Do you understand? We don't break. We don't fold under pressure." But as he spoke, he realized his words held less power than they once did. Fear had taken root among his associates, and loyalty born of intimidation was fragile at best. As the call ended, he felt a deep, unshakable sense of dread. His empire, built on manipulation and threats, was beginning to crumble. Back at the FBI office, Margaret's plan was unfolding smoothly. They had managed to bring in one of Hanin's enforcers for questioning, a man known for his loyalty to Hanin but now facing a choice between jail time and cooperation. Margaret knew this was their chance to drive a wedge into Hanin's network. Sitting across from the man in the interrogation room, Margaret leaned forward, her gaze steady. "You've seen how this goes," she said. "You protect Hanin, and you're going down with him. Or you help us, and we work with you to reduce your charges. It's your call." The man hesitated, his face tense, torn between fear and self-preservation. Finally, he nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "All right," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll tell you what I know." With this confession, the FBI began to piece together the final elements of Hanin's operation. Each detail, each name, was another nail in the coffin of his corrupt empire. Margaret's team worked tirelessly, building the case that would bring down not just Hanin but every officer complicit in his network. As Margaret returned to her office that night, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. Hanin's last moves had been desperate, ineffective against the force of justice now bearing down on him. With Turner's cooperation and the confessions of his enforcers, Hanin's empire was in free fall, and soon, the precinct would be cleansed of his influence. The battle wasn't over yet, but Margaret knew that Hanin's days were numbered. His control, his threats, and his power were no match for the truth now emerging from the shadows. The morning of Lieutenant Greg Hanin's arrest was one of clear skies and cool air, as if even the weather acknowledged the significance of what was about to unfold. FBI agents gathered outside the precinct, badges gleaming, their resolve evident in their expressions. Inside, Hanin was making his rounds, his usual composure beginning to crack as the weight of recent events pressed down on him. But he hadn't expected this. He hadn't thought that the system he controlled so tightly would finally turn against him. When agents entered the precinct and walked toward his office, Hanin's face drained of color. He attempted to maintain his authority, to brush off their presence with his characteristic air of dominance, but it was clear to everyone watching. Hanin's reign was over. "Lieutenant Greg Hanin," Agent Margaret Bryant said, stepping forward, "you're under arrest on charges of corruption, abuse of power, and obstruction of justice." The room was silent as she read him his rights, the officers and staff watching with a mixture of shock, relief, and perhaps even satisfaction. Hanin, the once untouchable figure, was now just another man facing the consequences of his actions. And as the agents led him out in handcuffs, Margaret felt a sense of closure settle over her, a quiet satisfaction that justice was finally being served. Back at the FBI office, Margaret and her team began sifting through the evidence gathered from Hanin's files, his personal accounts, and the testimonies of those who had once worked under his command. The case they were building was airtight, supported by months of undercover work, surveillance, and painstaking research. This wasn't just an arrest. It was the start of a systematic cleansing of a corrupt precinct, a chance to restore the integrity that Hanin had tainted. As the investigation continued, the scope of Hanin's influence became apparent. For years, he had been the architect of a toxic environment, manipulating young officers, bending the rules, and intimidating anyone who threatened to challenge him. But now, with Hanin behind bars and his network of associates crumbling, the precinct was facing a reckoning, a chance to start anew. Outside the precinct, the community gathered, eager for news and perhaps, for the first time, filled with hope. They had lived for so long under the shadow of a system that often seemed to disregard their rights, their voices, and their dignity. But now, as news of Hanin's arrest spread, there was a renewed sense of possibility, a belief that change was not only possible but within reach. Margaret watched the scene unfold from the sidelines, her mind reflecting on the journey that had led her here. The operation had been grueling, testing her patience, resolve, and even her faith in the system she served. She had seen firsthand the toll that unchecked power could take, not just on the people who suffered under it, but on those who wielded it. Hanin had once been an officer with potential, a man committed to enforcing the law. Somewhere along the line, he had lost sight of his purpose, becoming consumed by ambition, pride, and a belief in his own invincibility. For Margaret, the investigation had been a reminder of the fragility of power, the way it could corrupt even those who had once upheld justice. But it had also shown her the resilience of the community, the people who had waited patiently, enduring the abuses of a broken system, hoping for the day when someone would finally listen. As she looked around at her team, she knew the work was far from over. Dismantling Hanin's network was just the first step. There would be more battles ahead, more cases to investigate, and more officers who needed to be held accountable. But the groundwork had been laid, and with each arrest, each testimony, they were moving closer to restoring the integrity of the precinct. In the days following Hanin's arrest, Margaret was approached by community members, people whose lives had been impacted by the corruption in the precinct. Some thanked her, their gratitude a stark reminder of the lives that had been touched by the investigation. Others shared stories, recounting experiences of mistreatment and discrimination they had endured for years. Margaret listened, knowing that while justice had been served for now, there was still much work to be done. Reflecting on the case, Margaret recognized the importance of vigilance, of staying committed to the principles that guided her work. The operation had taken a toll on her, emotionally, mentally, and physically. She had spent countless nights reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and confronting the darker sides of law enforcement. But the rewards, the satisfaction of knowing that justice had been served, outweighed the hardships. For Sam Turner, the events had been a brutal wake-up call. Once fiercely loyal to Hanin, he had come to realize the extent of the damage caused by following orders without question, by prioritizing loyalty to individuals over loyalty to the law. In the end, he cooperated fully, his testimony instrumental in dismantling the corrupt network Hanin had built. While his future was uncertain, he had been given a second chance, a chance to rebuild his life and perhaps, in time, redeem himself. Looking out over the city, Margaret felt a sense of peace settle within her. She knew that corruption could never be entirely eradicated, that there would always be those who sought to abuse their power. But she also knew that as long as people were willing to stand up, to question, and to fight for justice, there would always be hope. The precinct, once marred by scandal and fear, was now on the path to reform. New officers, young and idealistic, were stepping in, determined to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. And for the community, there was a newfound belief in the power of accountability, in the idea that even the most entrenched corruption could be brought to light. Margaret took one last look at the precinct before turning away, a faint smile on her lips. Justice had been served, and while the journey had been long and difficult, it was worth every moment. She knew that there would be more battles, more investigations, but for now, she could rest easy, knowing that the fight for justice was ongoing, and that she was ready for whatever came next.